Good evening and welcome to the British Empire Study Group's webinar. This is Bob Gray and I'm here with my co-chair, Joan Harmer. The Collectors Club is a group of men and women who have an interest in British-related philately. We enjoy both the social and technical aspects of learning and sharing and presenting. And when we can, we meet at the Collectors Club in Midtown Manhattan. And then when we're not in New York, we meet on webinars like this one. So British Philately, from the first stamp collector and stamp dealer, the first postage, modern post office and the first postage stamp. British Philately spread throughout the British Empire and as a consequence through much of the world. There's hardly a place in the world where either the British Army or the British Post Office has not been. So you have field post offices and post offices abroad and former colonies and possessions. So if you collect almost anywhere, a portion of your collection is probably related to British Philately. Our next British Empire Study Group meeting, and this is the building where we will not be meeting in Midtown, will be Zoom again, December 17th at 6 p.m. It'll be Tom Droge, Stamp Auction Network, bringing the next generation. A little housekeeping. Please, you'll have an opportunity for questions, but please put them in the Zoom chat box, and these will be addressed after today's programs. It's now my pleasure to introduce Gary Loew, our speaker. Gary was formerly the Director of Expertising at the American Philatelic Society and now serves as the Editor-in-Chief of the American Philatelist and the Philatelic Literature Review. He's been a collector since age 8, and today his collecting interests are focused on the stamps and postal history of Gambia and the 1935 King George V Silver Jubilee issue. Gary is a life member of the APS and a member of the Collectors Club, the British Empire Study Group, and several other philatelic societies. He's written over 50 articles on philatelic subjects and wrote a regular column for the Kelleher Stamp Collector Quarterly. He has also taught at the APS Summer Seminar and many national stamp shows. So it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Gary Loew, who will be presenting Solving the Mystery of UPU Specimen Stamp Irregular Blocks. Well, Gary,
thank you, Bob. It's good to be here, and let me just bring up our screen here so you can see the presentation. Is that all visible, Bob? Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
All right, well, we're off to a roaring start then. I'll try to keep this to about half an hour or so we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. And as Bob said, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box as they occur to you. All right, so what we're going to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about what a specimen stamp actually is. And I'll show you the first specimen stamp. Discuss a little bit about the printing of specimens, the ordering and distribution by the UPU, the Universal Postal Union. We'll look at some simple multiples. We'll look at some very pretty strips. And then we'll get to that weird looking irregular block, or actually the three of them, those blocks of 5, and try to figure out what's going on. But first, it's time for a pop quiz. Now, since you can't all talk or raise your hands, this is going to be the honor system. I'm not going to be collecting blue books afterwards, but yeah, the first question is, why are we all here? And I think there's a simple answer for that. That's because we're all philatelists. But the real question here is, why are we philatelists? To get to the answer to that, I'm going to turn to a noted philosopher, but you wouldn't necessarily think of him as a philatelic philosopher, except I think I have the proof here that that's exactly what he is. Now, of course, I'm talking about Scott Adams, the famous philosopher expressing his views through the Dilbert cartoon series. And here we've got Dogbert saying, why do people collect stamps? And Dilbert's obvious answer is because they're valuable. And then Dogbert wants to know why they're valuable. Well, that's because people collect the good ones. So you collect stamps because they're valuable, and they're valuable because you collect them. Yep. That sounds pretty fulfilling. And this is really the key to it right here. Because Dilbert is saying, to be honest, I just do it for the adrenaline rush. And that's my view of things. I do this. I do philately for the adrenaline rush. I don't know how much of a rush you're going to get out of this presentation, but doing the research for it was a lot of fun. And I learned a heck of a lot along the way that I'm going to share with you. So what is a specimen stamp? Well, the seminal work from Marcus Samuel identifies specimen stamps of the Crown Colonies, and this is about the only thing I'm going to read to you other than the cartoon, a stamp or stamp proof that has been provided or preserved as a sample for which no payment has been made to the revenue, and that has been defaced to prevent its postal or fiscal use. Now, just recently, 2015, James Bendon came out with his award-winning book on the UPU specimen stamps from 1878 through 1961, and he's identified 12 different kinds of specimen stamps. Postal authority specimens, and then this is one that I'll show you in a moment, used to notify the local postmasters of an issuance. So it's a transaction, if you will, a communication between the postal authority and local postmasters. Printers' reference specimens were kept for internal use very frequently. When a stamp was ordered by a postal authority, the printer would retain extra internal copies, primarily because they were expecting a reorder and they wanted to make sure they had sample copies of what they had done originally so that a reprint would identically or at least closely match if they were going to be using the same printing plates, of course. Official reference specimens were kept by the post office itself, by the postal authorities, or in the case of Great Britain and the British Empire, by the Crown agents as well, when you're dealing with stamps of the colonies. Presentation specimens are little ego trips where when a visiting dignitary showed up, they would be given a presentation book that had stamps, and those stamps were generally defaced with the word specimen, so presentation specimens. They're not all that uncommon. They were given away quite readily, and I think you can judge that by the frequency with which those charming little presentation books show up on eBay at not outrageous prices. So they're fairly common, but they're really nice to have. Stamp printing specimens are older issues, generally those that have been demonetized or are no longer available for use, no longer valid for use, that were distributed as samples by printers. But in this case, of course, they were defaced even though they were no longer valid. Printer sample proofs is another example of a more modern or still in use kind of stamp that was distributed after being defaced to prospective clients. Nowadays, when postal clerks are in training, they are given fake stamps. They are given dummy representations of real postal stamps to complete their training. But early on, postal clerks were trained with real stamps, didn't want to lose control over something that could be used for postage, so they were defaced and used as training devices. Exhibition specimens are really very cool because for the most part, these are complete sheets or complete panes that have the specimen marking on them, but were used at printing exhibits to show the printer's wares to buyers of printing services. Philatelic specimens, I think unfortunately many of us have seen those show up in collections if we buy them. Many countries were printing stamps far in excess of their ability to be consumed through normal postal usage, or for some reason a new denomination was required. And in both of those cases, the excess stamps, instead of being destroyed, could be sold by the postal authorities below face value, but they had the word specimen printed on them. Display specimens. I remember when I was a kid going to the post office, and in the windows, you could see the stamps that were available for sale. Those were real postage stamps. They were not pictures of the postage stamps. They were mounted on display cards, but they had the word specimen imprinted on them. Press specimens were, just like a lot of other handouts, used by postal authorities to give as samples to the press so that they could be reproduced. But again, the word specimen was printed or sometimes perforated, as in perfins, into the stamp. And then there are the UPU specimens, which can either have the word specimen or not on them. And we'll get into a bit of a discussion on that as well. The first postal authority specimen came out at the time of the first stamp in 1840. The penny black was issued May 1st of 1840, and in April of that year, a document like this was distributed, I believe, to every post office that was open in England where these were going to be valid for use. There were 2 stamps affixed as samples and a letter of introduction from the secretary of the post office describing to local postmasters what these stamps were, how they were to be used, how they were to be sold, and how they were to be canceled. What you see here is one of 3 known surviving examples of that first postal authority specimen. Now, those 2 stamps that we saw were cut from a full sheet of 240 subjects, 12 stamps to the row, 20 rows to the sheet. And I put a note up there, it's not in my collection. To the best of my understanding, this particular piece is not in anybody's collection. It was assembled stamp by stamp, image by image, and knitted together digitally to create this simulation of an original sheet. And it's quite an impressive reproduction. I am not aware that there is an entire sheet surviving. If it is, it might well be in the Queen's collection now, but I'm not aware that there are any out there. So we've got this sheet of 240 subjects from which those postal authority specimens were cut. Now here's an example of a printer's sample proof. When I bought this, I thought it was a forgery because none of these stamps were issued imperforate. But here we can see that it's on unwatermarked paper, it is imperforate, and while the original is in myrtle and orange, this one is not. It's in black and orange, but it is in fact a printer's sample proof. That DS1 designation is from the catalog developed by Marcus Samuel, and that's just one of his catalog identification types for that word specimen that you see here on this stamp here. Now, the first keyplate issue, which was issued for multiple colonies, Cayman Islands, what else? Seychelles, and several others. This is from an issue that began in 1898 through 1902. Here we see the tuppence as a specimen. Now, in this case, this is not just a Stanley Gibbons 39, which is the normal version, but this is the one with the deformed S on the right-hand side, and that got it the letter A. The S designation is for specimen, so this is a Stanley Gibbons 39AS. Here we can see an example of the earlier cameo issues. This is from 1880. The first of the cameos was in 1869, but this is from 1880. And it's Stanley Gibbons number 10. But this is a forgery. If you look at the end of the word specimen, you will see a period. A period was never used on any of the specimen stamps of the British colonies in this period of time, certainly not before King George's time. So very clearly a forgery. If you look on the back, which is the right-hand image, you can see that the ink has actually bled through. I am aware of no genuine specimen stamps where that has occurred. Nevertheless, the forgeries are very interesting to collect, and they can command a premium price, sometimes even over the legitimate specimens. Pricing on specimens is as much art as science, and market is difficult to predict. So one never knows whether a specimen stamp is going to carry a premium price or not. And especially interesting is when a forgery can carry a price premium over the genuine specimen. Okay, let's look at some multiples a bit here. And what we've got here is from the 1921 key plate, King George. These are specimen pairs. The normal range of the set itself would be Stanley Gibbons 108 through 116. These pairs each show one of the two known varieties of the letter M. Here you can see the letter M on the right-hand side has got a little divot at the bottom. And here you can see what looks like a broken M with a divot on the right-hand side. Best of my knowledge, these are the only pairs that exist that show both the clubfoot M and the broken M variety. It's very difficult to find a complete set of pairs to begin with, but with those M varieties, this is, I mean, if you think about it, there's only 6 possibilities because there were 6 sheets imprinted for the specimens, and we'll get into some detail on that in a bit, but this is the only one that's been at least reported. Let's do a little bit of analysis and have a look at what kind of multiples are possible. Pairs, obviously, I just showed you, and pairs in themselves are not terribly uncommon. They are out there, but the different possibilities are a function of the number of stamps that were required by the UPU for distribution among the various member postal authorities. So, for example, with that first keyplate issue, the UPU required 730 stamps, and they were sending 5 stamps to each postal authority. Let me back up for a second. If you look further down towards the end of the Edward VIII reign, the series of keyplates from 1909, there were many more members of the Universal Postal Union, but they only required, the UPU only required 3 stamps for distribution to member postal authorities. Okay, so here we're looking at a full sheet. These are not specimens, but it's a nice example of what a full sheet looks like. 120 stamps coming from 2 panes per sheet. So here you see a severed pane, 60 stamps, 6 stamps per row times 10 rows. That was the condition, that was the structure of the document as it came off the printing press and had been slit, that was used for creating specimen stamps. Now, the printer would send as many sheets as was required, plus a few extras if those were required. But at the UPU, the clerks themselves would tear the sheets. They weren't cut, they weren't scissored or in any other way mechanically separated. They were folded and torn by UPU clerical folks from these full panes. So going back to this view, you can see here in the early period, 5 stamps per member, and down here, 3 stamps per member. So when 3 stamps were required, the UPU was doing this. They would take a horizontal segment of 3, a second horizontal segment of 3, and then go down each of the rows. So you would get, out of a sheet of 60, 20 horizontal strips of 3. It's 2 strips a row times 10 rows. When 5 stamps were required, which is the earlier period, you could still get those evenly out of a sheet. If you tore the sheet horizontally into a strip of 5, and there were 10 rows, you could get 2 strips of 5 going across. So here we have an example of surviving strips of 5, these from the Queen Victoria key plates. Here's an interesting question. If the Universal Postal Union made a determination that 5 stamps needed to be sent to each postal authority, why would any of these have survived as entire strips of 5? Wouldn't they be broken up and distributed to the post offices that needed to use these? Well, the answer has to do with the fact that for large countries, they did in fact need 5 and sometimes even more of these stamps. But for smaller countries, it was only at the exchange office, the exchange post office, where foreign mail arrived and foreign mail was shipped out, that a specimen was really needed. An inland post office wouldn't be the first touch point for an envelope coming in with some other country's stamp on it. So it's only at the exchange office where the validation needed to take place. If a certain country only had one exchange post office, foreign exchange office in, let's say, a port city, they would keep them together. And that's exactly what happened here. I don't know what the origin of this particular set was. There's some speculation, but the strip was kept intact and used by postal authorities to validate the incoming stamps, but there was nowhere else for them to be used, so they kept them together. Well, if that's the case, and if my explanation of how these sheets were cut up makes any sense, then what would explain these irregular blocks of 5 that I'm showing you here? When I first saw these, I showed these to James Bendon, the author of the, originally the 1988 book on specimens, but then the revised one in 2015. And he said he'd heard of these, he'd never seen these before. So this was a confirmation that they actually did exist, but it was hard to explain why there would be an irregular block of 5 as opposed to a strip. Now, it took a little bit of finagling to figure it out, but here's what it looks like. This is from the 1905 series when 726 stamps were required by the UPU, and 5 were required for each member. Well, 726 isn't divisible by 5. The quantities required that are noted with an asterisk, that was a period of time when the UPU was actually keeping a sample copy for itself. It was not a validating organization. It didn't need to verify whether an incoming envelope was genuine or not. But during these periods of time, the UPU kept a single stamp itself, not 5, but a single stamp for its own archival purposes. So what we've got here is 726 stamps being required for the 145 members of the UPU in 1905. If we take 12 sheets, we get 720 stamps to get us 144 vertical strips of 5. And I'm quite sure that that is exactly what was created out of those 12 sheets. But they were shy another 6 stamps. While the UPU was responsible for tearing those sheets, or the panes rather, into strips, an extra sheet was not sent to the UPU. The printer only sent as many as was exactly necessary, in this case, to meet the 726 stamp requirement. So the UPU kept 1 stamp for itself. What happened was when a clerk in the printer's office was assembling this shipment to the UPU, the clerk decided how that extra set of 6 stamps was going to be shipped. The clerk could just as easily have taken a strip of 6 off the side of a sheet, or a strip of 6 off the bottom or top of a sheet. Instead, the clerk took a block of 6. And what we see here, and the explanation for why you don't have strips but have an irregular block of 5, is that the clerk sent a 2x3 block, and when it got to the UPU took out the 1 stamp they needed, and this particular block was shipped to, we don't know which French West African colony, but the provenance apparently is that this came from a French West African colony. So we've got this now block of 6, from which 1 was taken for the UPU, and that's how we ended up with an irregular block and not a strip. So, well, it's not a great mystery. It took a little bit of finagling to understand how both the UPU and the printers dealt with the need for certain numbers of specimen stamps. Now, this was a block of 6 taken out of a sheet of 60, and the remainder of that block was retained, the remainder of that sheet, I beg your pardon, was retained by the printers for use in their other operations, and could have ended up as any of the dozen possible, or some of the dozen possible stamps, specimens that that printers used. But there is another mystery here that I want to put forward to you, and we can ponder it. If you notice, these 2 stamps have perforations in them, as does this one. Now, these are amazingly round, and they look like they could easily have been punched by any sort of a punch to deface stamps. It was very common, especially in British colonial stamp printing, for the printers, even before specimens were being created, to deface stamps that were to be distributed by using a hole punch. I can tell you that these holes do not match any known hole punch used by any of the printers during this period of time. So it's not likely that this was an intentional defacement. I put these under a high power microscope, and I can tell you that they are astoundingly round. There is speculation that these are simply wormholes, not an unheard of occurrence in stamps that have sat around in archives in humid West African nations. So that's definitely a possibility, but it's difficult to determine just what caused these. The roundness, the smoothness of the edges really suggests a mechanical device. The provenance really suggests hungry little worms. And I leave it to you to make your own opinion as to what it might be. You can see here that there is, on that bottom left stamp, there's a little bit of a stain that might suggest that it could be a wormhole, but it's hard to determine with any certainty. Okay, this talk was based on an article I wrote that appeared in the June 2019 issue of Cameo, and I've put together a PDF slide deck. If you are interested in downloading this presentation, it's available from aps.buzz/BESG-Gary with the ARY being lowercase. aps.buzz/BESG-Gary. One final note, I am a big believer in making philatelic articles available to the general public after a period of time after they've been published. So I've taken every article that I've written and loaded it up on academia.edu. If you're curious about some of the other things I've done, go to independent.academia.edu/Gary Loew, and you'll be able to get any of those you want downloaded at no cost. Let me close with another philatelic lesson from the philosopher Scott Adams. And Dogbert wants to get some help in figuring out the valuable stamps. Well, Dilbert gave absolutely the wrong answer. Philately will get you nowhere. It is my contention that philately will get you everywhere. And I thank you so much.
Wow, Gary, that was just fantastic. Yeah, Keith was sitting here listening to it, and I was quizzing him as you were talking. It was just fantastic, and I want to thank you for joining us and thank everyone for attending. And we have a lot of really good questions. So are you ready? This is a quiz.
Well, we'll find out, won't we? Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to start out with some of the easy ones. Are plate numbers known to exist on these specimens?
Plate numbers on the specimens.
Yeah, from the specimen sheets. Are there plates like?
Well, the sheets back then, as I was showing when I had those earlier sheets and panes distributed, had not a numerical series of numbers like we're used to with US plate blocks, but you would see a circle in the margin that had a 1 or a 2 most typically. And yeah, so you've got in the selvage, you've got those kinds of indications. I don't recall that I've ever seen a specimen that had that kind of selvage. I mean, the pairs that I showed had selvage off on the right-hand side. So postal clerks at the, or UPU clerks, when they were tearing these strips, would leave the selvage on. So there's no reason that one of those couldn't exist. I don't recall that I've ever seen one though.
Interesting. Okay, another interesting question. I think you answered it, but I'm getting old, so I'm forgetful. Why did the UPU need more than one stamp per member?
If a particular country's postal authority had multiple foreign exchange post offices, then you would want one for each incoming source of foreign mail. So, you know, a large country could have even more than 5, and sometimes they had to make a decision which of the incoming foreign mail post offices would get those distributed to them. But yeah, think about it this way. If there were 140 members, round numbers, of the UPU in those early years, you might have 20 large mailing large mailing countries, and 120 that were relatively small, and those 120 might only need 1 or maybe 2 stamps, but the larger countries would have multiple ports where post offices were located.
Oh, great. Have irregular blocks from other countries ever been reporting, or is it just Gambia? The irregular blocks.
Sure.
From
yeah. There is one other known or I should say there's one other reported but not seen. And when I was working on this with James Bendon, he said that he had heard of this second one. I forget if it was like Mozambique or someplace like that, but there's been no other reported irregular blocks like that.
That's interesting. Okay, now Edward asks, this may be a silly question, but why wouldn't a printer print the proofs on the regular paper opposed to the paper that the stamp was intended to be printed on, opposed to just a normal sheet of paper, like a specimen paper?
Okay, well, it's not a silly question at all. The printing paper was more expensive. The stamp printing paper was more expensive. The answer is that you wouldn't want to create a separate printing process just to create specimens. If you were printing thousands of sheets and you would take out 10 or 12 or 14 sheets or whatever the right number was, it was very easy to take them right off the press after they'd been perforated and gummed, pass them through the press that would apply the specimen designation, and then ship them from there. The other reason, and probably equally important, is that you wanted to give a live example of the stamp, not something that sort of looked like it, to postal authorities who were going to verify whether incoming mail had forgeries or not. It is not just today. It goes back to 1840 and the issuance of the first stamp, that forgery was the major concern of postal authorities. So the validation of a stamp coming in from a foreign country was an important aspect of maintaining postal integrity. And you really wanted a genuine stamp. They were gummed on the back, just like the regular stamps were. You could compare gum on the specimen stamp and know that it's a real stamp.
Okay, now were the specimen overprints made on a full pane or sheet at a time and on a printing press, on a single printing press? And that's from Richard Kohlberg. So Richard, if you want to clarify that, we could do that after hours. Does that make sense, that question to you?
Yeah, they were panes at that point. If it was a sheet that was being split, it was a pane that was sent through a different printing press that was set up for providing that overprint. I should point out, and I didn't give examples of it here because it wasn't germane to this conversation, but for a great many of the specimen stamps, they weren't overprinted. They were perforated with the word specimen, and just like you would see a normal perfin with some company's initials on it, the word specimen was applied either as a straight line word specimen, or sometimes it was a horseshoe shape perforation that spelled out the word specimen. So those obviously had to go through different kinds of presses. That wasn't a printing press.
So you could tell I'm a stampless person, right? Okay, now I'm going to read this from Frank Walton because it's the club foot M,
Yeah,
position 47,
right.
and broken M, position 41, varieties relate to the M of the specimen and not the M of Gambia. They exist in all countries that use the type 12 overprint, and not just those countries that have the letter M in them. Is that agree or disagree?
That's new information for me. I've got some homework to do.
Frank to email him.
Okay, so Frank, why don't you get in touch with Gary afterwards
Yeah.
and continue that discussion? That's an interesting point. And again, not something that
Jimmy
happens.
Capadia.
Okay, Jimmy Capati asks, let's see. I have seen stamps overprinted with Ultramar overseas. Can you please comment on what these are?
I have heard of those. I am not familiar with those. I am not in a position to comment, I'm afraid.
They were the equivalent of it.
Okay, so specimen stamps are relatively rare, a few hundred copies.
Mhm.
Why don't they attract much of a premium? And that's by Ian.
Well, that's a wonderful question. It's been debated, on the intellectual level, I suppose. But prices are determined by willing buyers and willing sellers. And for a long time, people were not interested in any kind of a stamp that looked to be defaced. To this day, perfins and even pre-cancels are looked down upon in many circles, but it depends on what your own personal collecting preferences are. Certainly early on in the history of philately, people wanted pristine stamps, and something that had the word specimen on it was not regarded as pristine. So, but it's just a market determination for any kind of price.
Okay, were there any problems with the letter G on that Gambia stamp looking like a smudge away from a C? Does that? So were there any printing problems with that letter G looking like a C? Do you know? Not that you know of.
Not aware of any.
Okay. How about counterfeiting? This is another good one by Richard Kohlberg. Was counterfeiting a big issue?
Of postage stamps?
Yeah. Well, with the, I guess with the.
Are we talking about
with
the
the
stamps? Or are we talking about
specimens.
the specimens?
I believe in specimens.
Okay. Well, it was enough of a problem that we identified. I showed you one example. I've got others in my own collection. And in fact, there is discussion of forgery. It really wouldn't be counterfeit. You're not looking to steal from the postal authorities. If you're faking a specimen overprint, you're looking to steal from collectors. So those would be forgeries, not counterfeits. But both Marcus Samuel and James Bendon have something to say about the frequency and kinds of forgeries. And I think one of the chapters or sections in James's book is identifying known forgeries. So they're out there.
Okay. And were specimen stamps ever used on letters, even though they were defaced? Like, did someone ever try to get away with, or did they get away with sending a specimen on a letter that you're aware of?
I saw an example recently of a cover that had a specimen on it, but it was deemed to be a forgery. The cover was a fake.
That's interesting. So now, just did the specimens go out to the countries before the stamps were issued or after?
As close to concurrent as the postal authorities were able to get them in the hands of the UPU and then distributed back out. There wasn't an intentional delay. They were just processing delays. They weren't sent out in advance, however.
Okay. Okay, we get agreement of forgeries, not counterfeits. Okay, let's see. Is the UPU program really effective? You know, someone's thinking of the African scam that all those letters made it through the mail?
I'm not
So
sure I understand the question.
Was this specimen, using specimens, was it effective in, do you feel it was effective in deterring fake stamps, or I guess it would be counterfeit stamps in this
Those
case?
would be
because they're-
counterfeit, yeah. Well, that's a very good question. The program was carried on forever and a half. The postal authorities, by virtue of their having continued it, suggests to me that the program was effective. I have not seen any literature on the detection and embargoing of counterfeit stamps that would give me any evidence one way or the other. But the fact that it was continued, and it wasn't a cheap process going through all of that special handling and overprinting and sending to the UPU, and the UPU sending out to all of its member nations. That's an involved process. If it had not been effective, I would speculate they'd probably not have continued it.
Interesting. And we have some, I guess, people who know a little bit about worms and grubs, and
Yeah.
I think that we're taking bets. We're trying to take bets on what those little holes are. But I think that's, we're getting close to the hour. I'd like to bring people over so they could really talk to you. I'd like to really thank you for tonight. I'd like to remind everybody of our next program, which is on December 17th. And that will be with Tom Droege of Stamp Auction Network, another, a discovery type program. So that should be interesting. And at this time, I'd like to thank you, Gary. Thank everyone for watching, and bring everyone into the audience. Please remember to put your microphones on, put your video on so we could see you. I see Scott English there. That's a great liking. And feel free to chat with Gary. Thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, folks.
And Robert, thank you. My co-chair, Robert Gray, did a great job with the introduction.
Hey, thank you, John. Gary, it was a great program. I learned an awful lot about specimen programs, probably more than I need because I don't collect them, but it was very interesting. Thank you.
My pleasure.
How you doing? There was an interesting question by somebody about why specimens haven't been more valuable due to basically scarcity. And I remember when Marcus Samuel's book came out, we were all sitting in the describing room, and I think Dad had come in and said, hey, there's finally a catalog coming on about specimens. And we all went, oh, finally, somebody will do something about them. And then it came out and there wasn't any value in the book. No values were posted, and we all sat there and they go, oh, very informative, and put it on the snooze network. And that was the worst thing he could do on it, was not to assign values or even rarity. I think he did a little bit of rarities, but I think, I don't know, it seemed to have a stigma in the old days, the specimens.
Yeah.
As being secondary of importance, and Marcus did not defer that from the future. So that's my little 2 cents in there. I got another question later, but let other people jump in.
Oh.
I would expect more wormholes, more samples with wormholes if worms were that big of a problem. Because Africa is kind of famous for all kinds of worms, including guinea worms and things like that we're still trying to fight. So I kind of expect more wormholes if that was the real issue.
This is Ed Grabowski here. I have a number of covers from Guadeloupe and Martinique that have single wormholes in them, just around the same size as the wormholes Gary showed.
Yep.
So sometimes they're only one. Actually, I've not seen a cover with multiple wormholes.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, it's Frank Walton here. The standard for Waterloo's, the British printers, was to, instead of overprinting the word specimen, certainly in post-Second World War period, they did in fact punch a very small hole in the corner of each stamp that is how they actually identified their specimens.
Sure, that was the case with their well, the silver jubilees, the 35 silver jubilees from Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia, and southern Rhodesia in particular, South Africa, all of those. But those are a much larger diameter hole than the ones in these stamps. And I've not seen any known defacements using punches of the size on these three blocks. I'm inclined to the wormhole theory.
I think I've had some in Sierra Leone, and I've just been searching my image archive and I can't find them. And they're remarkably similar to yours.
Really?
Yeah, I shall have. It's getting late here now, but I shall have a good look tomorrow morning for you.
All right. Well, you know how to reach me, so I'll be very curious about that.
And on a
Can I come in? Going back to the wormholes, if you've got a pile of papers and a worm is going through from top to bottom, you will get those holes. I've seen the same in leather with a grub coming out of a live cow. It has the same effect and leaves a complete round, circular hole. The other thing is, going back to your ultramar, that's Portuguese for specimen, which was put on the stamp when it was received in that country, whether it was Portugal or the colonies.
That's right, yes. Yes. As far as the wormholes in the cow, I would venture that the cow cared a lot more than the stamps did.
I have a question about your wormholes, and that is, have you talked to anybody who is actually a specialist in insects or in worms to determine whether they in fact create these perfect circular holes?
That's a very good
know
question.
about that.
Yeah, no, that's an absolutely valid question. And yes, when my paper was published in Cameo, I received several emails from philatelists who are also familiar with wormholes, and apparently those holes can be astoundingly symmetrical, astoundingly circular. So even though I measured them carefully and was satisfied that at least 2 out of the 3 were almost perfectly symmetrical, that doesn't discount the possibility that it's a wormhole.
Good for the worms.
That's it.
The green button.
Okay, this is a Madagascar UPU specimen sheet. When the stamps came into Tamatave, I believe it was Tamatave, the principal port city, they were actually pasted on these large sheets and then tied with these cachets. And this is these are examples from Indochina and the French offices in Indochina. And it's part of a collection of 25 sheets of these things that was sold for $40,000 back in 1998 or something like that by George Olivizos. Okay.
Are they marked specimen, or does the cachet do that for you?
No, the cachet does that.
Ah.
Okay, these were sent as specimen stamps, you know, from French authorities to begin with, and this is the way the Madagascar post office handled them.
And is there a verification of that signature in the bottom? Like, is that a?
Yeah, well, that's the signature. Each page is signed and dated, and presumably that's the postal authority who is keeping track of these. That's the assumption. They all 25 pages are available on the website of the Society of Indochina Philatelists. If you want to look at all 25 and get them in a better view, you can expand the view and play with it. It's fairly fairly high resolution.
Wow.
So you can look at these, but this was one single purchase. It's in the catalog that Alavizos and Argyle Itkin put out back in the 90s when they were selling these things. And this was by far the largest lot of them. And they sold it as one lot for $40,000.
I love the contrast of the bright orange and red with the black.
Yeah, it's
Very lively.
They're quite striking. And as I said, it's 25 sheets. And I think there are a couple from Russian offices too in there.
And you're raising a very interesting point that was outside of the scope of my talk, but as long as you brought it up here, there were many instances where stamps were sent by the originating country to the UPU without being defaced with the word specimen. They were just mint stamps, shipped out, and the only way they can be determined to be specimens is if those stamps remain on sheets, much like this, even if they aren't canceled by the receiving nation, but that the sheet can be identified as having emanated from an archive of one of these receiving nations. So there's a very long discussion of that aspect of collecting specimen stamps that James Bendon goes into, because especially in the latter years of specimen stamps, countries just weren't bothering to deface them with the word specimen.
Yeah, there's this cachet. The cachet that goes with these. I'm trying to get an example, but I can't find it.
When you can't.
Were these now these sheets, were they all initially in one binder and then kind of like medieval books, pages cut out and sold separately?
Alavizos and Argyle Etkin bought a large portion of these UPU specimens. I don't know where they came from, all countries. And the Indochina was sold as one lot. Right now they exist in a special binder. But that might be post handling. I believe this red cachet here does mention Bern, which suggests these came through Switzerland.
You can see other examples of these kinds of sheets being released from archives on James Bendon's website. Many of those are for sale, but others are just part of his own collection as well. So yeah, over time, when retaining those archives became postally irrelevant, many countries decided to raise some money by selling those archives to the philatelic community. That's how so many of them got out.
Do they still send specimen stamps now that we have like email and?
Scan.
I don't know. Truthfully, I don't know what good it would do. Counterfeits are so good today. You know, those are just impossible to detect. Forgery, not forgery, counterfeiting is just so effective today. I don't know that that there's any purpose to be served today by trying to intercept counterfeit stamps on foreign mail. Today's stamps are more difficult to counterfeit, especially because of the microprinting technology and other means of creating unique stamps. But the bad guys are always the early implementers of advances in technology. That's just a universal truth about everything technological. And so postal authorities are always racing. The security printers are always racing to keep ahead of the bad guys in terms of making it more difficult to counterfeit stamps, but more particularly currency.
This has been really great. I know it's getting late. It's almost 7:30. Robert, any other questions, comments? I caught him with his mouth.
No, I think it's been a really good chat session, and I hope to see a lot of you on December 17th. And I'm looking forward to that as well. I guess until we have better times, this is what we do. And we're getting to learn. I think a lot of people are getting to learn to Zoom very, very effectively. And I think the post-meeting chats is a really a nice way to end a social, nice way to have a social event tied to some philatelic education. So thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Bob, the only thing you need to figure out how to do is have an open bar.
Oh, we have an open bar.
We do.
Individually.
Absolutely. At
Sounds
the
good, Gary.
Collectors Club, when you join, you can join us. Better times.
No, I'm talking about a Zoom open bar.
A Zoom open bar, you gotta, it's BYOB.
Okay.
We
Good
try.
night, good night,
Good night. Good night.
good night.
So Robert, you get the video. Oh, Gary, would it be all right for us to put the video up? I'll send you the copy of it first.
Sure. Sure. I
Okay,
don't think
so I'll
I
let
did
you see
anything
it
unusual
before
to embarrass myself, so sure.
Okay, well, I'll let you preview it first. And
Okay, fine.
Preview, yeah.
well, no, because sometimes you catch something, and
Redacting, that's what it's called.
Right.
I've
Anyway,
learned how to edit.
Larry told me he'll give me the link tomorrow, and I'll put it on quick time and cut off the general discussion and just have the presentation. That's
All right.
Okay. Yeah, if you
Sounds-
want, that would be fine.
Okay,
And
I'll share-
we're
I'll share
gonna
a
put
link
it
with you.
on. Great, and we'll put it on the YouTube channel, or are you gonna just?
I have
think
no
that's the only way.
idea beyond, I'll have to figure out how to use QuickTime. Okay,
All right, well, if you want, I could edit it. Yeah, I have no problem. editing.
then terrific. I'll send you the link.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
I'll stop the recording now.
Thanks again. Okay, let's
Okay.
adjourn. Good night.
But we can certainly organize like a mass toast. We can just tell people in advance, bring your own glass and your own bottle. And I see some people are prepared. Well,
So
okay.
when we're at the club
Cheers.
for the British Empire meets, I usually do themed meals that go with, so if you were talking, we did fakes and forgeries. So I did all fake meats, like vegetarian meats. And then when Carol did her talk on transatlantic, it happened to be on the day the Titanic sunk. So I recreated the whole Titanic menu. Not all of it. We were out of like foie gras and some of the like $50 a bottle dishes, but look at that.
Oh, very
So
nice.
I hope when this all blows over, you could all come in and we could have some good food and good drink. Thank you again. Thank you, Robert, for getting this organized. Thank you so much, Gary, for
My
agreeing to
pleasure.
present. And
My
it looks
pleasure.
like everyone seemed to have a very nice time and very nice attendance. I think it was
Yeah.
great.
Have a good night,
Great.
folks.